Welcome to our first xTalk for spring. I'm very excited to be here and to hear from our colleagues on this topic on what you can do to foster a type of community where students are comfortable and encouraged to share their perspectives on course topics and to ask questions. And just to say, if there's any questions after the talk, there will be time for discussion, but in addition, we do have additional resources on the residential education website, so you can check that out or just save that hyperlink here. And my role on the team is I'm the Learning Science and Education Outreach Specialist. And again, just really excited to be here. So what I wanted to do was just quickly show the prompts that we've given to our two speakers, who we'll introduce shortly. So the way this will work is we'll talk about the prompts, and then we'll have each professor speak. And then we'll open up for questions. So with that being said, I'm super excited. I'll introduce Stefan Helmreich here, who is our Elton E. Morrison Professor of Anthropology, and he'll be sharing his experience in several different courses, including 21A 500, 21A 303, 21A 505. And we'll also be hearing from Maxine Jonas, who is our Senior Lecturer in Biological Engineering and also a Biological Engineering Communications Lab Fellow, sharing her experience in 2309. So let me just show you the questions that we've asked of these two presenters here today. So basically, how are you helping students to feel encouraged to share their perspectives? And what actual digital tools are used in the course that help with that effort? And also, because both of these instructors have actually implemented several tools over multiple semesters, they may have really great advice on how to incorporate these into courses, some tips and tricks, maybe lessons learned, things like that. So that being said, I think we'll go ahead and give the floor to Stefan Helmreich.
Yeah, so let's see. I've taught a number of classes in recent years using digital tools that were kind of new to me, mostly through Canvas and via Slack. But I guess maybe I should preface this whole thing by talking about the pandemic, which has been a real conditioning set of, it's been the condition of possibility for pressing me to do some of these things. I think I was super concerned during the pandemic, and still, of course, now, to figure out how to help students feel part of a community, feel included, especially when we were all kind of thrown into our own little television screens over Zoom. And so I think a lot of what I continue to do now is inflected by that moment that began during the pandemic. And, you know, the question of how to generate community. And, you know, the Canvas site was kind of rolled out, I think, during the pandemic, if I remember my history correctly, for many of us. And one of the affordances of that was Slack. So I'm telling you something you already know. But I found Slack to be a super useful, a super useful platform for getting students to say things before class and then sometimes even during class to each other. So what I've got on the screen here is a class that I taught called The Anthropology of Biology, which was about the politics of biological things, from like reproductive politics to biodiversity stuff. And the syllabus was organized in such a way as to sort of be easily legible from the Canvas site. So the syllabus and the Canvas site are organized kind of exactly the same, which I found super useful because students stopped reading the syllabus. Right? Like there's all these documents and they sort of needed a one-stop shop place to go. So so all the readings sort of were here. And then what I did was after each session, I would post the slides that I used for that session. Right? So here, for example, okay, let's force quit Acrobat. So here, for example, we have, I'm not going to report that. You know, the title of the session and then the slides that corresponded to that session, which then students would be able to access after I'd given the lecture, right? Like not before. They had to come to class to see how it went, right? And but then prior to class, what I did was had them get on Slack. And so I made little channels for each of the sessions of the class You know, so here, for example, here's the evolutionary narratives and epidemiological dramaturgy unit. And the students kind of signed in, like, don't look at their names. The students signed in and said, this is what I thought about this article, that article. And so by the time that they walked in, and sort of as a mix of things, right? Like some people had very personal reflections, and other people had kind of more no-nonsense, here are my bullet points. But by the time everyone walked into class, everybody had contributed. So I think that turned the temperature down on here, I'll minimize this so I'm not sharing people's names, right? Whoa. Right. It's like in high school, I took a genetics class. Throughout the readings, I was, you know. Anyway, so I sort of reassured people when they walked into the classroom, you've already participated. Don't worry about speaking. You've already done it. If you don't want to say anything, that's fine. And then also, I guess one of the things I did to open class sometimes was ask people to pick someone else's post that they really resonated with and that they really liked. Emphasis on resonating and liked, right? No hating on other people in the class, right? It was like positive comments about something that really interested you about what one of your colleagues in class said, and use their name and refer to them by name. And we know each other, so let's talk to each other. So that I think was really useful for building community, and that worked pretty well both on Zoom and in person. They're small, so this was like 20 students. I mean, actually, I did have a class with 55, and I kind of tried to do somewhat the same thing, just do it a couple times. Not everybody speaks, right? But I think the other thing, and I also have tended to teach in 3-hour blocks, so some of this is not necessarily transposable, but some of it is. I think during the pandemic, it became super important to me to check in with people and to spend the first bit of class, like 20 minutes, asking everyone, how are you? Right? With the pandemic waning a little bit, it became a bit shorter. Just say, tell me one thing about your weekend, or tell me one key word from the readings that you really liked or that really got you going. So I think doing that was very useful. And then also, as you might imagine, people start responding to each other in this thing. It's like, yeah, I really liked what XYZ said, but I thought of it differently. And so some of it was also kind of spelling out rules of engagement about how to respond to people, things like that. And I mean, I've done this, I guess, many, many times by now, and it's always worked well, and the students report that they really like it, and it really takes the pressure off when they walk in the room, right? Well, I mean, I want to take the pressure off them performing, because, I mean, it's about, I want the pressure on in terms of them doing. This is also a way of trying to get them to do the reading, because they don't really have anything to say unless they do the reading. So it's sort of, there is a bit of backstage police work. There's like a little good cop, bad cop, right? So the bad cop is in the background asking you to post something based on the readings as though that's a normal thing to ask, which I think it kind of is. And then once they've done that, then it's good cop time, I guess, right? That it's about taking the performance pressure off and to kind of reassure them that they're actually doing really well already. And I think I've come to learn that it's really important to do a lot of scaffolding throughout a semester to make people feel as though the work is not getting ahead of them, right? So when I give them, for example, paper topic assignments, I'll tell them, you've already started because you've done the reading that is required for getting started on these things. So in fact, you've just seen this assignment, but you're already on top of it. And just to kind of tell people, like, at every step, to remind them about what they've already done, right? And I guess the other thing I've done is I've done a bit more group work since the pandemic, and like put people into groups to help each other, right? And then sometimes asking them to do kind of digital things, like, here's how to use the library at MIT online. Here's how to search a journal, right? Like, why don't you guys get together and figure out what you're all interested in for this topic and help each other find articles, right? So it's not just you going like, yeah, I don't need to, I'll do it later. I'm going to shop for shoes instead, right? But instead making people feel responsible to each other. And I think a lot of it is that, is generating a sense of community through participation, right? Participation makes community. And so that's the thing I try to do. I mean, this was only one tool, right? Really, I mean, there are a bunch of other stuff. Like, I tried to use some of the other things, like taking a poll, and then I got confused, and then, well, what does the poll mean? So, I mean, I think it's also like one tool at a time, don't do everything, right? And don't do things using digital tools that you can just as easily do by asking people to raise their hands and stuff like that, you know. I mean, I was a bit, yeah, it took me a while to kind of figure out Slack, but once I did, and then I had to sort of face up to the fact that, okay, in order for me to do this, I need myself to make all of these channels and input every single student's email address into every one of them. So that's going to take me like an hour and a half or something at the beginning of the semester, and it's like, yeah, I'm just going to do that. Other people might ask their TAs to do it. But there is this kind of thing about like building the infrastructure before the class begins and also making it transparent to the students so they kind of don't even know that you did all this work. They're just like, yeah, I'll just click the thing, you know. I mean, I guess there's the yes and model, right? Which is that if someone says something that you find you want to take on, that you want to kind of affirm the fact that they said it and then say, yeah, and also this, right? But I think I also really depend on the readings, right? So instead of, I want the students to talk to each other, but I also want them to talk to each other in the class we're taking, right? Like, let's talk about, yeah, you said that, but what does the reading say about that? Which also takes it, sort of makes it one step removed from their own opinion. I think people kind of panic if it's just, it's like, well, I think, I mean, especially I'm teaching anthropology, which is always about social power and inequality and can get super touchy, right? But it's always good for people to say, well, but I thought this about the article, and I'm confused why the person is saying that, and then someone else will, so you can sort of take the pressure off by referring to the material, right? Which might be, yeah. Yeah, I mean, this becomes participation. This becomes, right? And so, and in some cases it does sort of stand in for things like speaking in class, because there's some people who are like painfully shy and they just don't want to talk. And if they've said something amazing in here, it's like, that's fine. I'm not here to change you, you know, in the course of 1 or 2 weeks, right? So, but it definitely calculates into their participation. So those are just a few little tricks that happened. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So my name is Maxine Jonas. I'm in the Department of Biological Engineering at MIT, and I'm also an alumna of my home department. And today I want to tell you about 2309, Instrumentation and Measurements for Biological Systems, that I've been teaching for 10 years now. And of course, I want to tell you how it relates to today's topic of allowing students to form a community and to ask questions and share their perspectives. So I'll start with a fun video that my colleague Steve Wasserman prepared. So in 2309, students build a microscope from scratch with fluorescence attributes. And so in lecture, they learn a lot about the theory of optics and microscopy. They learn what decides of the resolution of the microscope, with which lenses to use for magnification. And then they, of course, study biology with it. So they make beautiful images of fluorescent cells. They also follow particles in cells, so they do a lot of computing to do some image analysis and video analysis. And a lot of students tell us that they really feel like real engineers taking the class, because otherwise biology is a lot of clear liquids in tubes and not much happening for real. And they work in teams, as you might have guessed from the video, typically of 3 students. And this is only half of the story and half of the semester. After that, we switch gears a little bit and we tell them about signals and systems and control theory. So typically in electrical engineering, this would apply to understanding how a mystery circuit transforms an input sinusoidal wave, for instance, of voltage, into an output wave that has the same frequency but different amplitude or different phases. And so for us, we kind of review this with the students. They get a bit shell-shocked because they're in biological engineering. And then we draw analogies with a biological system. And so now our mystery circuit is a yeast cell, same yeast that you would use to make bread or beer. The input sine wave is a change in osmolarity or salt concentration of the culture medium, and the output of fluorescence localization. And so to do so, we draw a lot of analogies with other engineering disciplines, and we introduce concepts such as Fourier transforms and transfer function and the body plots, and explain how amplifiers can lead to feedback system. So it's a pretty ambitious class. But the reason why we're successful and that our students agree to go through this journey with us is that really we have a lot of interactions with the students in the lab. We're very proud, and I say this with humility, that we always get really good scores or evaluations from the students, and that they find that the course is useful and that they can reuse it later in their jobs or something like that. So on paper, the students spend about 12 hours per week with us, 3 hours in lectures, 6 hours in the lab, and 3 hours on homework, for instance, some coding, etc. And maybe a little bit unusually, instead of having fixed lab hours in particular for them, we open the lab more than 30 hours a week, and they kind of come whenever it's convenient for the team. They can also come outside of these times and ask questions about the rest of the homework that they have to do. And so when I was asked, presented this prompt by Jovi, I was thinking, well, we do certainly feel a sense of community in 2309, but the first thing I can think of is all the human interactions that create this community and this inclinations to participate, to have conversations together. We have a large team of 3 full-time instructors, 2 TAs typically, and about 30 students. So not too many. It's still a pretty small group. Yeah. And we're not, we take turns because we don't spend all of our time in the lab. We have to prepare lectures and do other things. We have flexibility in the job, which makes it really cool. And so all 5 of us mean that we have different personalities and teaching styles, different background educationally and culturally. So I think it helps just addressing the students' needs from many people. And we really make a big point of having a low barrier to questions in the class. We always tell the students that we don't care if they feel behind, if they haven't read things. We want to help them that day understand where they're at, where they're lacking something, and build from them, celebrating their progress rather than just pure accomplishments. And a lot of troubleshooting goes on in the lab because they put together a microscope for the first time, so of course things don't work, and we don't know either why they don't work. So we go through a typical engineering mindset of asking where the issue is, trying to measure the discrepancies, making a new model of what might be going on, and so being little investigators like this with the students. We also open the lab on Sunday, so that adds to the spirit of we're in this together, and we just spend time together. We also encourage collaboration on homework. The students can always work together. So that, of course, highlights the strength of different students. They can always also ask us if they did things correctly or not. So we're not about being hardcore judges, more about them learning. And they also report that they, as young adults, feel that it helps them feel dependable and feel like they have to show up to have to work as a team, because things don't get done if they're not all there together. Mostly. And then luckily and importantly, we find that the little classroom we have next to the lab ends up being also a very important tenet of this participation and community building aspect of the class, because there they can have food, drinks, talk about their weekend and their dance show, and they can also tell us, they can also work on other things rather than 309. And I need to be faster, but I'll highlight a cupcake party that they always appreciate on the last day of classes that we even held outside when we couldn't be on campus during the pandemic. And so Was it a surprise then that last year we were extremely honored to be recognized as awardees for Teaching with Digital Technology Award? Not really. And I say we, by the way, because my colleague Steve Wasserman is extremely instrumental to this class, and we've been really running it together for the past 10 years. Our class was recognized as being very organized and supportive for students, and so indeed we recognized that being sent remotely during the pandemic, we had to develop new tools to recreate the interactions. So in particular, we put all of our materials in MITx, a mix of texts that would be like a wiki, of videos. We kind of truncated our lectures essentially in little digestible chunks, and a lot of inline questions that allow the students to have low-stake ways of checking that they understand what's going on. We also sent them home, or we mailed to them a nerd kit with a lot of electronics parts, so they could do a lot of lab work at home. And we use Slack also and Zoom to help them extensively. And all of this was orchestrated by Canvas. That was also our central tool to direct the students to all the other ones that we were using. So we found that actually digital technology was a great help in making the class more inclusive, because like Stefan was saying, because of transparency, because we can say exactly what to do, when to do it, the deadlines are clear, how and why we can link the assignments to our objectives for the whole semester. Or also similar to Stefan, we typically release Canva week after week, and so we can be very responsive to students, adding a tutorial, adding example questions, and our lectures as well. We've also found that MITx in particular was making the class more accessible and more flexible, because all the materials are present in MITx. If the students miss class, it's okay. That happens for many reasons. And they have ways to digest the materials differently. Some people don't like coming to lecture. They prefer watching things in 2x. So the automated recording lectures through Panopto are a better way for them to learn, and others really like the presence and the prioritization that happens in lecture. And then we also find that we can have a more equitable way of teaching coding in particular, thanks to MATLAB Grader that's included in Canvas, where we can have some scaffold of code with the students only having to write 1 or 2 lines. And so that's also a great way for them to not be overwhelmed with a huge coding assignment and see some nice example code to borrow from. I'll say quickly that Gradescope is a great tool to grade quickly with pretty extensive feedback that can be personalized and point deductions that can be very consistent, because any rubric creation you create for one student can be just chosen for another student at the click of a button. So it's really a fast, personalized and efficient way to grade. The students can also contest their grades and say why they would like a different one. And Gradescope can also let us implement late policy kind of automatically. We do -10% per day late and also drop a whole assignment. And most importantly for us, it's also been Slack that's been extremely useful for students to share their perspectives and ask questions. So we have a general channel where students introduce each other at the beginning of the semester, where they can, of course, see all sorts of announcements. The most important channel that we created and that we use a lot is the one called Help Me, where at any time of the day the students can get help. So of course that's very supportive, and that can be at the time that they want. We try to monitor it very often, of course. It also kind of normalizes asking questions. It can be better for some introvert students. Sometimes we've noticed with international students. And when typing something is not adequate, we just go to Zoom. And nowadays we see that students don't use Slack and Zoom as much as during the off-campus semesters, But they still do, when we give them a nerd kit for the second part of the semester and they can do a lot of the work at home, they still do that because they prefer doing it at midnight in their dorm rather than coming to lab. And so it becomes a mix of in-lab and at-home work. And they still use Help Me Slack much more. And Zoom has been very, very helpful. Because it was still individualized to answer Slack questions, it still created some connection between students and teachers. And we also, even though everybody recognizes Zoom fatigue, we also really liked having Zoom last spring, for instance, when everybody got COVID last April. We just finished the semester on Zoom because the sick students felt a bit left out and nervous. The healthy students didn't want to catch COVID, so we just called it off and finished on Zoom and kept everybody in a fair engagement this way. I'll just finish shortly by saying that I think 309 is a great illustration of the mens et manus motto of MIT. We actually went so far as to recreate a new seal because we thought this one wasn't really diverse enough and people didn't seem to like each other that much. So ours is lens et sanus for the lens and health. As far as words of advice, of course, we find that if we have practical, team-based exercises in the class, it really develops community and encourages conversations and exchanges among students. We love using digital technologies for what they're good at, but I think we still value having the class in person and having a lot of in-person interactions. We also noticed that what worked during the pandemic, like asynchronous lectures and then getting together for questions, doesn't work at all anymore. The students want the real lectures, old school, and we haven't really managed to completely flip the classroom. And finally, I want to recognize a lot of people who have helped to mix together digital technology and in-person teaching. So Steve Wasserman primarily, Jolly Sutton, who was a previous colleague of ours, and then Cheryl and Meredith, who were very patient and very, very helpful when we were discovering MITx at the beginning. And then overall, the leadership in biological engineering gives us a lot of freedom and of trust in teaching our class, so really we feel that we can do it the way we think is best. And thank you all for being here today.
Well, thank you both again. And you know, I think for me, one of the things that I found really striking was all of this does take some effort on your part, whether it's like just planning an hour and a half, like for the semester start to get things set up, or whether it's being available to answer those questions. And so, one of the things that I'm wondering is, do you have advice or things that you've learned that help to sort of help you navigate like your time and prioritizing how to when and how to respond to students, or setting students' expectations, for example, or even like grouping questions as needed? How do you sort of deal with the barrage of questions that come up, which you want to happen, but then how do you sort of respond to that on your side?
I'm happy to start, yes. First of all, I do agree that it takes time, of course, to set up a new tool and use it well, but with digital tools, it's pretty easy to reuse, copy, paste, and so setting things up for the first time is a big effort, but then there's a lot of, it gets easier the next time by far, and we can copy, paste. And then I agree that Slack is both a, how do you say, a curse and a wonderful tool, in the sense that it allows us to hear students in real time at any time, but indeed we set an expectation for us for Slack. So we say, and we've decided that between noon and 8 p.m. we would respond within half an hour or something, but at other times maybe we're doing something else and that we'll just respond whenever we can. And we're clear about this, and usually everybody's in front of their computer all the time anyway, so we end up responding, and it's not an issue anymore, also because the students have so much time with us that they don't really need to find us on Slack as much anymore, actually.
You know, kind of, I think, related to this as well is there any point at which you try to transition or look for patterns in the type of questions, or even the discussions and conversations that students are having on a reading, that raise the level of like, oh, let's bring this up as a bigger group, as opposed to just like one-on-one responses between students or between student and teacher? I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that.
On my end, certainly, first of all, if a help me question comes back, I can always say, hey, look at what I told the other person. But most importantly, if many students seem confused about something, then we'll make a point of going through it, maybe at a review session, or do an extra, hey, we're going to talk about this evening, who wants to come and what time would work. So yeah, that's one way that we get a pulse of students' understanding, is by seeing what seems to be confusing to most people, and then we dive and address that.
So it kind of has that ebb and flow between like the sort of online discussion and what sometimes you do in your interactions in person, or perhaps even on Zoom as you do. Does anyone have other questions?
Well, to second what Maxine was saying, I mean, certainly you discover that there might be areas where people are struggling to understand a concept, and you need to pause and you need to reintroduce it. So, I mean, and that's not necessarily that's not the technology, although the technology affords the possibility of seeing that happen. Maybe it is the technology. I mean, it affords the possibility of seeing that happen in a way that maybe everyone sitting around in class not saying anything doesn't, right? Because it's like, is everybody got it? People are all quiet, like, oh, okay. But you know, maybe it's not okay, right? And the technology helps you understand that you need to go back and redo something.
Yeah, the most immediate answer is usually it informs the next semester's lectures, where we like, okay, we need to put emphasis on this. And sometimes just the next day's lecture, if there's really something fundamental that is being missed, we can take time to address it.
One thing I've struggled with and would like to do more is kind of curate a bit of the afterlife of the class on OCW. So, you know, I've been approached by OpenCourseWare many times, you know, like, can you update this class? And certainly, and it's often the case that they say, can you give us an example of some representative or excellent student work? And I never know exactly how to deal with that, because I don't always want to single out a student as, you know, having done something so much better than their peers, right? Because people check in on these things, right? So I'm never, I mean, I can make things anonymous, but yeah, sometimes I'd like some of the work that we accomplished to be kind of, to have a durable future. I think in my anthropology of sound class, my students and I put together a Bandcamp page with all of the sound work, sort of critical thinking about sound in one place, and they could refer back to it as like kind of a reference point for what they learned. So I would like there to be a kind of digital afterlife, and it feels like OCW is kind of the place to do that. But again, and then sometimes I've settled on like this. Okay, this is going to be the great paper that we want to put up as an example. And then the student never responds to my message asking their permission, right? So sometimes the students have moved on and they're not as interested in, they're just doing their next class.
We're still worried that we have too many tools. Canvas really helps a lot, bridging them and making them work together. And I don't think the students suffer from that anymore, because I think they're used to it from several classes. But I think it might be a good time for us to survey the student and check how they feel about, for us we have MITx, we have Canvas, we have Gradescope, and then we have Slack and Zoom sometimes. So I'd like to see whether we should try to consolidate somehow probably by Canvas getting better and better at seamlessly incorporating the others. And the other point I was thinking about is the same as Stefan's, in the sense that we were approached this past summer again about, in like August 25th, someone is like, oh, let's put your class on OCW again this semester because it's outdated. And we're like, there's so much, it's very hard to translate a lab class into OCW, and with 5 days of preparation and someone who had never taken the class before, we were like, we should take more time to prepare this carefully and probably have someone who already understands the material and what's going on in the lab to be able to translate this to a good OCW class. So it sounds like it's a very worthwhile enterprise, but I don't think it's going to be straightforward. So.
And to go back to a question that you posed earlier, which speaks to this question of how many tools to adopt, et cetera, in terms of my own time management, I find it useful to have things contained in Canvas and Slack, and not necessarily always showing up in my email, right? And especially now that I'm working right now as department head, I've got a lot of messages coming at me like all the time from all directions. And so it's nice to have like, okay, now I'm going to do the class, and it's over in this box, and it's not leaking everywhere, right? I think that's a huge issue, sort of like for instructor well-being, is to figure out how to manage it without letting it complete. Like it's great that you have 35 hours of availability, but it's a trick to manage, right? I guess there's 3 of you, but or 5 of you.
That's why we have a job, is that a department head and professor with a research lab wouldn't be able to spend so much time on the class.
We are very thankful to have had you here today and answer their questions.
Thank you.
So let's just give them all a round of applause.